Madam President, I'll share a lot more about our Spanish history, our roots in this country, and I thank the senator from Massachusetts for his kind indulgence so that I might share this with the Senate. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Thank you. The senator from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam President, thank you very much, and I congratulate the senator from Florida. I'm delighted to accommodate him and join with all Floridians in a good celebration of a great part of our history. Madam President, obviously everybody in America is more than well aware that the date of August 2nd is fast coming at us. And they are also, unfortunately, well aware that the United States Senate and the Congress appear to be stuck yet again at this moment. In fact, here in the Senate, we're debating a constitutional amendment to balance the budget instead of balancing the budget. I've heard of a lot of sidesteps around here, but this is what they call a message amendment, and it's sending a pretty mixed message to America. But what we, in effect, ought to be doing here is not trying to pass a piece of paper that tells us to do what we know we ought to do. We ought to be doing it. And what we ought to be doing is stopping our country from defaulting on debt that has already been obligated. What people are refusing to do in the House and on the other side of the aisle is live up to our obligations. This is not suggesting that we're giving permission to borrow more money, to spend money on something irresponsible in the future. This is paying the debts of our country. Money already spent, already obligated. And here we have a so-called Cut, Cap, Balance Act that passed the House of Representatives. It is, everybody understands, nothing more than an ideological message exercise. Everybody knows it's not going to pass the Senate. And we know even more that if it did pass the Senate, it's not going to be signed by the President of the United States. So what it's doing is taking up time that we ought to be spending with a real solution on the floor of the Senate that addresses the needs and concerns of the American people. We ought to be reaching that compromise. What this does, unfortunately, is, in terms of message, send a message to the American people that this place may not quite get it still, and that a lot of folks here are more prepared to play politics than to really engage in the real business of our nation. Now, if you looked at the specifics of this constitutional amendment that is not going to pass, it's divided into three parts, and each and every one of them are equally problematic. The cut part would require immediate cuts that would cut almost 1% of our GDP, which economists tell us would result in the immediate loss of 700,000 jobs. So they're coming to the floor with a program to actually cut 700,000 jobs at a time that most Americans believe job creation is the single most important thing that we could do here in the country, as well as avoid defaulting on our debt. The cap part locks into place the unrealistic spending levels that the House passed in their budget, while at the same time preserving hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and tax loopholes for the biggest corporations. The balance part, you almost don't even have to comment on that. I think every American scratches their head and says, what? They're going to put in these unrealistic caps that would strip away research and development, education funding, the ability of kids to go to college, all of the things in which you build the future job base of our country, strip that away. But hey, let's preserve the tax cuts for the wealthiest people in the country who, incidentally, may be investing the benefits of those tax cuts in China or in India or job creation in many other places other than here. And the balance part of this amendment requires the passage of a balanced budget constitutional amendment that would require a supermajority to raise any new revenue or close any wasteful tax loopholes. So in other words, you don't have to have a supermajority to decide where and what you're going to wind up spending, but you have to have a supermajority in order to raise any revenue or close an egregious tax loophole, one that may have no economic purpose, may be completely outdated, may be a sweetheart deal that got into the tax code over the course of the years, but you still have to get a supermajority to get rid of that. Everybody here knows how hard it is to get 60 votes. A lot of the business in the United States Senate has been caught up by the eternal filibuster. Every single nomination, every single small piece of legislation that comes to the floor of the Senate, everything requires a motion to proceed, which requires 60 votes, which is effectively a filibuster each time. And we've had a record number of filibusters in the United States Senate compared to any other time in the entire history of the United States of America. So requiring a two-thirds supermajority would lock in gridlock, would lock in bad policies for the future. And the constitutional amendment that is proposed would make all revenue-raising measures unconstitutional unless they secured a two-thirds supermajority in both the House and the Senate. Now, again, I repeat, we do not need a piece of paper, new one. We do not need an amendment to the Constitution, a group of words, to tell us to do our duty. Every single member of the Senate raised their hand and took an oath of office right over here beside the presiding officer and said they promised to uphold the Constitution of the United States. All we need is the courage and the conviction to make the compromises and do the business of the United States Senate. And it's not going to get any easier just because you pass some words that tell you to do it. We did this in the 1990s. What I'm talking about is not pie in the sky. It's not some theory. We balanced the budget in the 1990s. And we did it without a constitutional amendment. We did it. We had people of good common sense who came together, and we voted the compromises, and we not only balanced the budget, we created a $5.6 trillion surplus for America, and at the same time, we created 23 million new jobs for Americans. And guess what? While we balanced the budget in a sensible way, without artificial caps and artificial draconian instructions, but with common sense, while we did it, every single quintile of American earners, income earners, rose in their income. Every single American quintile saw their incomes go up. America got richer than at any time in America's history, even as we balanced the budget without a balanced budget amendment. So I'll tell you, if we go down the road that our friends on the other side of the aisle are proposing, you would see major reductions in Medicare, major reductions, much worse than what the Ryan budget has proposed. Social Security beneficiaries would receive a $3,000 reduction in average recipient benefits within 10 years and be forced to see deeper cuts down the road. I think it is safe to say, without exaggeration, it would put an end to Social Security and Medicare as we know them today. This week, Eric Maskin, Robert Solow, and Alan Blinder, each Nobel laureates in economics, and other renowned economists, sent an open letter to President Obama and the Congress in strong opposition to a constitutional balanced budget amendment. And these economists stated that a balanced budget requirement to the Constitution would be a very unsound policy that would adversely affect the economy. They believe adding arbitrary caps on federal expenditures would make the balanced budget amendment even more problematic. And a balanced budget amendment would mandate perverse actions in the face of recessions. By requiring large budget cuts when the economy is weakest, the amendment would actually aggravate recessions. Mr. President, Madam President, in the 27 years that I've been privileged to serve here, we've already debated this several times, and we have voted on it. And as I've said in the past, the most compelling argument against this amendment doesn't come from me or from anybody on the floor. It actually comes from the real experts, the people who framed the Constitution of the United States. If they were here on the Senate floor today, they would vote against this amendment because it violates the Constitution's basic tenet, which is majority rule. And the notion that the most fundamental document of law can be set aside for a time is ludicrous, and it's an anathema to the very reasons for having a government document at all. Now, Madam President, I had some more to say on this, but I notice the Majority Leader is now on the floor with other colleagues, and I suspect he has something to share with us. So I would yield the floor to the Majority Leader.
I would ask that my friend Curtis be recognized such that his statement not appear interrupted, and that when I finish my statement that he be recognized to finish his.
Without objection, so ordered. Majority Leader.
I want everyone to know who has any interest in this piece of legislation on the floor today that this is the time to come and debate it to their heart's content. If they want to debate it late tonight, we're here to do it late tonight. If they want to debate it tomorrow for a period of time, they can do that. But I'm going to, I think this piece of legislation is about as weak and senseless as anything that has ever come on this Senate floor. And I'm not going to waste the Senate's time day after day on this piece of legislation, which I think is an anathema to what our country's all about. So everyone understand, we're going to have a vote tomorrow. I'm not going to wait till Saturday. We're going to have a vote tomorrow, and I feel confident that this legislation will be disposed of one way or the other. The American people should understand that this is a bad piece of legislation, perhaps some of the worst legislation in the history of this country.
Madam President?
Senator from Massachusetts.
I gather my comments won't be interrupted, but frankly, after what the Majority Leader has just said, I don't think I need to go on with my speech, to be truthful with you. I'll just ask unanimous consent that the full text be placed in the record as if read in full.
Without objection, so ordered.
I hope that we will move quickly to the real business, which is avoiding default, coming up with a, let me just say, Madam President, I think there's one effort we ought to be engaged in, and that is the serious effort of passing the McConnell-Reed, Reed-McConnell, whatever you want to call it. Their initiative is not kicking anything down the road. Their initiative requires, just like base closing commission, for the United States Senate to deal with a big deal in a very short period of time. If colleagues want to speed that period of time up, I wouldn't object. I think that would make sense. But what we need to do is recognize that in the next few days, we do not have the time to put the kind of common sense to the task that will allow us to get the budget figures from the CBO, that will allow us to know with certainty that what we're doing with Medicare or Social Security or Medicaid or all of these other important initiatives are being done in the most deliberative and thoughtful way possible. That's what this institution is supposed to be about. That's what separates the United States Senate. This is often called the world's most deliberative body, but it hasn't been particularly deliberative on this subject in the past months. We have an opportunity with the Reed-McConnell initiative to be able to put in place a process that will guarantee that we have up or down votes on these critical issues after all the relevant committees have had the opportunity to weigh in, using perhaps the commission, the Budget Commission's report together with what the so-called Gang of Six, I don't think it's a particularly appropriate name, but with what they have proposed, which I think is a very constructive and important contribution to the debate. And it helps us have a starting point for this discussion as Congress, in the next short period of time, can actually fashion the kind of budget decision that benefits America and does credit to this institution as a truly deliberative body. That's what I hope we will do, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in an effort to make that happen. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Senator from West Virginia.
I apologize. I would rescind that request.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business
Without objection, so ordered.
for no more than 15 minutes, hopefully. Madam President, yesterday, at the direction of their leadership, the House passed an FAA extension. Unlike the 20 previous FAA extensions, their extension included changes to FAA policy that had not been agreed to by both the House and the Senate, both chambers. What is the effect? The effect is that this move will begin to shut down the Federal Aviation Administration. Beginning tomorrow at midnight, if we do not reach agreement on a sensible path forward to pass a clean FAA extension bill, the consequences of an FAA shutdown will be severe. This is not about me or the content of the extraneous provisions in the House bill. This is about being responsible and doing the necessary work to ensure that our aviation system continues to function at its highest level while Congress completes its business. Over the past 4 years, which is how long we've been negotiating this bill, we've been able to work together to do the right thing each time the FAA authorities were about to expire. Congress has consistently acted to pass extensions to make certain that the nation's air transportation system continues to operate safely. Therefore, we have passed 20 extensions over 4 years, waiting to do the work that we need to do for an enormous federal agency. In only one case were policy changes made during the consideration of an FAA extension, and that was last year. Airline safety measures were included because both the House and the Senate negotiators agreed to them, and the extension passed unanimously in both chambers. You don't pass an extension which has policy riders on it unless they've been agreed to by both chambers. It's very unfortunate that the House is taking a rash approach to pass a bill when we have made so much progress in negotiating a complete FAA reauthorization package. From the time the House passed the FAA reauthorization, we have had more than 3 months of productive negotiations where staff engaged more than 30 meetings, spent hundreds of hours developing this legislation. Over this period, we have worked the entire number of items to be resolved from 281 separate issues to approximately 10 separate issues, provisions of consequence. House and Senate negotiators have compiled more than 300 pages of text for a bill. All of the components of the legislation represent needed aviation policy changes that will improve the country's airspace system. I remind you that our country, unlike virtually any other in the modern world, basically uses radar as a way to approach landing or takeoff. It's embarrassing. It's ridiculous. I've been able to negotiate with the House Science Committee and the House Homeland Security Committee to develop workable agreements on all of our policy differences. 2 other committees in the House. The main items that need to be made final are difficult, yes, partisan provisions that fall within the jurisdiction of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, T&I, as they say, and its chairman, John Mica. The House bill was developed in a partisan manner. It had a number of problematic provisions added during floor consideration. Central to these was the decision to include language that would reverse a National Mediation Board decision from the previous year. The National Mediation Board, the NMB provision, was so tainted that it passed by just 7 votes in the House, which is overwhelmingly Republican. It passed by just 7 votes. Consideration of the final FAA package passed in the House by a party line vote of 223 to 196. Ultimately, the House FAA reauthorization bill garnered the narrowest vote margin for a House FAA reauthorization bill in almost 30 years. I'm talking about the House of Representatives. As the House well knows, the White House has threatened on numerous occasions to veto any FAA package that includes the House's National Mediation Board language. The House's addition of policy riders to the extensions that are being considered as part of the FAA reauthorization discussions represent an abandonment, in my judgment, of the good faith negotiations we've been engaged in for the last 3 months. The House acted without consulting the Senate on this FAA extension, without engaging the Senate on putting policy riders into their extension. From their actions and public statements, it's clear that this effort is designed to force the hand of the Congress on the National Mediation Board provision that President Obama has singled out as a reason to veto the legislation. That's the legislation which basically says that if you have a vote for a union or for whatever, and if you're not present and don't vote, your vote is automatically counted as no. This is a whole new concept of democracy in America, one which is very strange and very wrong. The House claims that negotiations on the FAA bill have been stalled over the NMB issue, but they have simply not done their work. It has been over 100 days since the House passed the FAA bill, and they have never even appointed conferees. We have done that. They have not. The Senate is ready to break this deadlock, but we have not been able to engage in a formal process because there are no House conferees. The Senate includes all of its conferees in negotiations and works through each provision to reach bipartisan agreement. And as I indicated earlier, we've gone from 281 down to 10 issues. The House only had Chairman Mica, and now the House leadership calling the shots on each negotiated item. It makes it very awkward to negotiate anything at all. If the House really wants to move forward, it is time they appointed conferees, and we'll be able to determine where things stand on what remains in the FAA reauthorization bill. But the Senate cannot accept the House sending over items that remain to be negotiated in a piecemeal fashion as part of this FAA extension. That is what they've done. Or, for that matter, any future extensions. And it may come to that. The American people expect Congress to work together to reach agreement. That's what I've been in the Senate for, is to reach agreement, not to have 20 extensions over 4 years. What an embarrassment, chopping the FAA continuity up into tiny little chunks so they can't even do let-out contracts and can't proceed with their work. The American people expect Congress to reach agreement, and I believe that we can do this, but it's going to take some more time. If the House continues its attempt to hold the Senate hostage on the FAA extension, it will result in a partial shutdown of the Federal Aviation Commission. And people need to consider that very seriously. A majority of the Senate is more than willing to pass a clean FAA extension of any length. This week, I introduced S-1387 with Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson and Senator Max Baucus to do just that. Our bill would give the FAA the necessary funding and authority to keep the agency functioning into September, I think September 16th. I've also indicated to the House on at least 4 occasions that I'm willing to drop all of the remaining controversial items that are not included in both bills in order to get us close to a deal. That offer, seemingly reasonable, has been consistently rejected by the House. Despite the House's lack of appointing conferees on the FAA bill and willingness to threaten the agency with problematic extensions, I do remain committed to completing this process in a proper and responsible way. Again, after spending 4 years trying to complete this bill, nobody wants a resolution more than I do. It's not the way to run a train, much less an airline. I believe that we can finish a comprehensive FAA reauthorization by August if the House will come back to the negotiating table in good faith. I'm willing to sit down at the table any time to move the larger FAA package forward or to develop an FAA extension that can pass the Congress. We will try to move a clean FAA extension through the Senate. And having said that, I ask that the other members to support this effort when that happens, which will be very shortly, and allow us to complete the FAA reauthorization bill. I'll just say a word on the consequences of an FAA shutdown. An expiration of the FAA will shut down any activities funded out of FAA's 4 capital accounts, which I will not name. This includes a program to halt
Would you tell him
the Airport Improvement Program, which provides $3.5 billion for infrastructure projects at airports annually and is estimated to support more than 150,000 jobs a year now. Non-essential employees will be furloughed, and approximately 4,000 FAA employees will be among them. If the FAA authorities do expire, the agency estimates that it could only operate air traffic and support services through about mid-August 2011. This would mean services to smaller areas like mine, West Virginia, would need to draw down in the near term so that the FAA can focus on primary traffic. That's not something that we would look forward to. The shutdown quickly starts to have safety implications, too. Safety projects at airports. It also places a hold on testing and implementation of next-gen efforts, next-generation efforts. That's the modern GPS-based system, which is clear, precise, and reads where airplanes are and how fast they can land one after the other with great precision. And fewer personnel will be available to dispatch to problem areas. So these are real concerns. Madam President, I hope my colleagues will hear what I've said. I hope my colleagues in the other body will hear what I've said. I want to proceed in good faith. I have tried. It has not worked. The American people are suffering as a result of it, particularly the aviation industry and the Federal Aviation Administration. I would hope that my speech will be listened to. I thank the presiding officer and yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Georgia is recognized.
While the distinguished chairman of the Commerce Committee and my dear friend from West Virginia is on the floor, I wanted to illuminate a little bit of the difficulty on the FAA reauthorization. And I share with the chairman, as he knows, because we talked in the well last night about our desire for a extension, a reauthorization of FAA and how important that is to our economy. But the difficulty between the House and the Senate, in part, has been over the House version as it treated the National Mediation Board versus the Senate's unwillingness to consider any change in current status with the NMB.
I have been the negotiator or the runner or whatever you want to call it between the two bodies, Mr. Mica and Mr. Rockefeller. And as the chairman knows, about a month ago I delivered to Leader Reid a comprehensive list of requests that the House had asked for in the reauthorization. Senator Reid and his staff, after pondering it for a few days, responded that they would not agree to any of the changes that were requested. I then went back and said, well, let me see what I can do to try and find some common ground, and came back with a recommendation that I gave to Chairman Rockefeller that said just give judicial review to the airlines, which the unions already have, to have a balanced treatment in terms of a response in terms of NMB regulation. As it turns out, that was an unsatisfactory offer. The House, I think, still insists that some provision addressing the National Mediation Board should be included in the authorization, and that, and if I'm incorrect in any way, please, Mr. Chairman, correct me. I think that is the primary difficulty in getting to a final conclusion. From my standpoint, I want everybody to understand clearly, I agree with the chairman that we need a reauthorization. But I also need to think we need a balanced playing field with NMB, and I continue to work to try and find some common ground to see to it that the aviation industry can have a judicial review, just as the unions already have with regard to NMB regulations and NMB rulings. And so I just wanted that to be indoctrinated in the record, and I thank the chairman for letting me have a little time.
Madam President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
Madam President, it's been reported that the White House has made an internal decision not to send Congress 3 long pending free trade agreements before the August recess. So I'd just like to reiterate that I, for one, remain as committed as ever to passing these job-creating agreements into law as quickly as possible, given the condition of our economy. As I see it, every sticking point seems to have been resolved. The White House initially said it needed a deal on trade adjustment assistance on the substance. I think they've gotten that. Then they said they needed an agreement on the process. I believe we've achieved that. I myself am personally committed to working with the Majority Leader to ensure a fair floor process for my members so they have an opportunity to try to amend a standalone trade adjustment assistance bill separate from the 3 free trade agreements. That way, if the administration can generate the votes it needs, TAA will pass on its merits. So I think we've got a pretty clear path in front of us at this point. I recognize that the calendar is tight, and we've got a lot of other urgent business to take care of around here, so I don't expect to finish any of this before August. Still, I think the administration should submit the agreements anyway as a show of good faith with our trading allies in Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Then we can work to pass them when we return. The administration has received everything it has publicly asked for on TAA. It's time to show they're serious about creating jobs and getting those deals done. Madam President, this is an opportunity to create jobs in America for Americans. It was snarled needlessly by the suggestion that TAA be dropped inside these agreements. That now has been cleared up. We're going to have an opportunity to ratify all 3 of these trade agreements, which will be good for the country. And the TAA issue will be dealt with separately, and all indications are that the votes are there to pass the TAA bill. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa is recognized.
I come to the Senate floor to tell my colleagues why I support the issue of cap and cut and balance. On August the 2nd, our nation will be unable to borrow money to meet our current obligations. We've known for a while that this was coming. Our annual deficits have been near $1.5 trillion for the past 2 years, and it's going to be that large this year as well. With deficits of that size, no one should be surprised that we've hit the debt ceiling. Which raises the question then, what has the President offered to confront this looming crisis? I ask that question because people expect a President to lead, and we have an executive budget, and an executive budget law since, I think, the 1920s has put the President in a lead on these issues. So I ask another question, what has the Senate Democratic majority done to address our deficit crisis? Because it is the responsibility of a majority to present a budget to the Congress of the United States, and we have not had a budget resolution for more than 800 days now. So I think you can draw the conclusion whether or not it's the President of the United States or the Senate majority. The answer is simple. Not much has been done. Last year, President Obama virtually ignored his own Deficit Reduction Commission. Now remember, in February 2010, the President appointed a lot of people to a Deficit Reduction Commission to give us a plan of what could be done about this fiscal situation that has happened so dramatically in the last 2 years. And there was no recognition in December when they reported that the President said that that's the thing that should be done in this country. So this year he did offer a budget, as he has to do under the budget law, in February the 14th of this year. And that budget would increase spending, increase taxes, and still add trillions to our debt. Now, everybody would think that a Democrat president suggesting a budget would be well received in a body that's controlled by the same political party. But that budget that he presented in February was so ill-conceived and out of touch that it was defeated here in the United States Senate by a vote of 97-0. Now let me emphasize that by saying not a single senator of either party voted for President Obama's budget. And, of course, that's very obvious that every member of the President's party said no to the President's budget. For the most of this year, President Obama said we should raise the debt ceiling without taking any measures to address our long-term deficits and debt. It was the position of this administration that Congress should simply rubber stamp another debt ceiling hike with no plan in place to reduce our deficits. That plan was voted on in the House and was soundly rejected there as well. All of the Republicans and nearly half of the Democrats in the other body voted against increasing the debt ceiling without deficit reduction. So it seems to me that we have a lot of bipartisan agreement when people say we have no bipartisan cooperation, that with the Senate's vote on the President's budget and in the other body, with nearly half of the Democrats opposing a debt ceiling without deficit reduction, that there's a clear understanding in a bipartisan way in the Senate that the President's budget spends too much, taxes too much, and leaves too much debt. And in the House of Representatives, there's a strong feeling that's bipartisan that if you're going to have a debt ceiling increase, there needs to be deficit reduction. So don't ever say that there's not bipartisan agreement, because it's been expressed in votes in both houses. The President then gave a budget speech in April, and I presume he recognized the inadequacy of his budget presented to Congress in February. He outlined a budget framework that would reduce that budget that was presented in February by $4 trillion over 12 years. So the President very quickly, in about 60 days, came to the conclusion that his budget was out of step with what people of even his own political party felt was necessary. So he could find $4 trillion to trim out of it. But you know what he hasn't done yet that a president ought to do in an environment where we have an executive budget process? He still hasn't presented the details of that budget. Now, the director of the Congressional Budget Office, that's Dr. Elmendorf, we all know, a person that is a devoted public servant to doing what's intellectually right all the time when he tries to help us decide how much money taxes are going to bring in or how much are going to be spent on a particular policy of Congress. Dr. Elmendorf was asked if he could estimate the budget impact of this new framework that came with the President's speech on April the 13th, which speech he came to the conclusion you ought to spend $4 trillion less than what he thought he could spend on Valentine's Day. And that's not necessarily a Valentine's gift in his February budget. And this is what the CBO director said in regard to that April 13th speech. He said, "We don't estimate speeches. We need much more specificity than was provided in that speech for us to do our analysis." But so far, the President hasn't provided those specifics. We've heard a lot from the White House about the need to come up with a plan when the President hasn't presented a plan. But the White House itself has never offered a single debt ceiling proposal for a vote. And the Senate Democratic leadership has also seriously shirked its responsibilities because, as I've said once before today, they haven't put forward a budget in more than 800 days, even though the law requires that they do it. Every family in America that works hard and sacrifices to pay their bills ought to be ashamed at the failure of the U.S. Senate to offer a budget in violation of the law. In sharp contrast, members of the House fulfilled their responsibility and passed a budget earlier this year. And so the very same majority party in this body that hasn't presented a budget for 800 days has done nothing in regard to the House budget but demagogue it. Well, they can't find time to compile their own budget. They've sure found time to make speeches that are derogatory about the House budget. And the House budget then obviously means that the House of Representatives did their responsibility under the law by presenting a budget and adopting a budget. While members on the other side come to the floor to oppose and demagogue the bill that I'm speaking about, the cut, cap, and balance bill, they've offered no plan of their own. While there is now a framework from the so-called Gang of Six, their plan also lacks any specificity. Perhaps that's the political strategy on the other side has chosen. Voters and the American people can't be upset with a position you've taken if you haven't taken a position. Just like a rule for political leaders is you never get in trouble for a speech you don't give. Perhaps this strategy may be politically expedient, but it's going to drive our economy and our country off the cliff. The strategy of placing a higher priority on the next election rather than the economic and fiscal situation facing our country is how we got into this mess. Based on the lack of proposals put forth by the other side, one could assume that they're perfectly content borrowing 40 cents for every dollar that we spend. Are they pleased with the deficits of $1.5 trillion annually? Well, you could conclude they must be, because they haven't offered a plan to reduce the deficits. On top of that, they've argued for tax increases. They must believe that we have a revenue problem. According to their argument, the American people are not handing over enough of their money to satisfy the needs of Washington to spend. And I'm not sure you can ever tax high enough to satisfy the attitude here in Congress to spend money. In fact, if somebody would tell me, how much money do you really need from the American people to satisfy your appetite to spend, and I could get a limit on it, and it was a hard limit, I might even vote for it. Because I'd like to have people say they're finally satisfied, that government ought to be so big but no bigger. But I never get those sort of broad statements here in the Congress, and so I've come to the conclusion that you can't raise taxes high enough to satisfy the appetite to spend money. But because we're borrowing money, the economy isn't growing and jobs aren't being created, is because Washington is spending too much money. Of course, the other side believes that the economy is not growing because we aren't spending enough money from Congress. Remember, just a few years ago, they passed the $800 billion so-called stimulus as a means to keep unemployment below 8%. That was early February 2009. That's when Speaker Pelosi said, yes, we wrote the bill, we won the election. So, employment shot above 8% right away, got up to over 10%, it's at 9.3%, so the promise of an $830 billion stimulus keeping unemployment under 8%, it just didn't work. So what do you do under those circumstances? You borrow money and spend it on government programs. And where is the U.S. economy today? Well, say it again, 9.2% unemployment. More than 14 million Americans out of work. And now the national debt is more than $14.3 trillion. This experiment, called the stimulus, proved that government spending does not stimulate private sector job growth. You know why? Because government consumes wealth. Government doesn't create wealth. The only jobs created by government are government jobs. They don't add value to the economy. They're a cost to the economy. Now, do you have to have government? Yes. Do you have to have government employees? Of course you have to have government employees. But to think you can hire more government employees and create wealth is false. The fact is we're in a hole that we're in because of our spending problems, not because we don't have enough revenue coming in. Now look at this historically. Spending has averaged about 20% of our gross national product. And that's probably over 4 or 5 decades. Today, and in recent years, spending has grown now in the last couple of years to 25% of gross national product. This level of spending cannot be sustained, particularly when revenue has historically been around 18% of GDP. And to this very day, it's less than 18% because the economy is not growing, but a 50-year average is 18% of GDP. For my colleagues who think that we can reduce deficits by increasing taxes, they need to understand that it just doesn't work. Professor Vetter of Ohio University has studied tax increases and spending for more than 2 decades. In the late 1980s, he co-authored with Lowell Galloway, also of Ohio University, a research paper for a committee of Congress called the Joint Economic Committee that found that every new dollar of new taxes led to more than $1 of new spending by the Congress. In other words, raise taxes $1, You think you'd go to the bottom line and reduce the deficit? But no. A dollar coming in, you spend more than a dollar, so you make the deficit worse. Professor Vedder has now updated his study. Specifically, he found, and I quote, that, quote, over the entire post-World War II era through 2009, each dollar of new tax revenue was associated with $1.17 of new spending, end of quote. So, history proves tax increases result in spending increases. We know that increasing taxes is not then going to reduce the deficit. Instead of going to the bottom line, tax increases are a license for Washington to spend even more. History also shows that tax increases don't increase revenues. Everybody thinks that if you raise the marginal tax rate, you'll bring in more revenue. But the taxpayers, workers, and investors of this country are smarter than members of Congress are who believe that. Regardless of the rate, over the past 40 years, and I'm sorry I don't have a chart with me. I had a chart with me a week ago that demonstrated this, but if you listen closely, you'll get the message of the chart. Regardless of the rate of taxation, over the past 40 years, revenue has averaged, as I've said before, about 18% of gross domestic product. Higher tax rates just provide incentives for taxpayers to invest and earn money in ways that reduce their tax liability. You cannot tax your way out of this problem. We have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. That's why I'm supporting the only plan that has been put forth to address our deficit and debt problem. The Cut, Cap, and Balance plan passed the House with bipartisan support of 234 members. This plan is the only plan offered to cut spending in the near term. We need to halt and reverse the trend of the last 2 years when government spending increased by 22%, not even counting the failed stimulus program of another $830 billion. And you can't increase expenditures 22% when the growth of the economy is about 2%. It just doesn't add up, and that's how you get into trouble, and that's how we have increased a 50-year average of the national debt being about 35% of gross national product. After 2 years, it's now 65%, and it's on a path to go over 90%. And you know where Greece is right now when they're over 100%. It's going to lead to failure. And we're on that path right now, and we got to preempt that. It will also impose budget caps. This bill before us will impose budget caps to get our spending down to a manageable level compared to our gross domestic product. Finally, it would impose a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution, similar to what, I don't know whether it's 46 states or 49 states, but most states have a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. And you know what? It works. You got to stop to think of a state that's as liberal as New York. If they can elect a liberal Democrat governor, and if he can cut to live within that constitutional requirement of a balanced budget, it ought to be something that we can do here in Washington, D.C. It's a discipline that works in the states. It's a discipline that we need through our Constitution. So when you take an oath to uphold the Constitution, the requirement of a balanced budget is something you swear to, and you'll see that you deliver on your promise to the American people. So it only makes sense to impose a requirement that we live within our means. Washington proves again and again that it needs this kind of discipline. I'd say to my colleagues, if you don't support this plan, then offer your own plan. You know that the debt limit must be increased, but you also know that we must take action to reduce the future levels of deficits and begin to bring our debt down. Where is your plan to do that? Where is your budget resolution that hasn't been presented in the last 800 or more days to the United States Senate, violating the budget law? How will you meet the responsibilities then of being elected to this office where you take an oath to uphold the laws and the Constitution of the United States? The trajectory of our debt is alarming. It will soon undermine our economy and our economic growth. If we do nothing, our children and grandchildren will have fewer economic opportunities than we have had. So this isn't just an economic issue. This is not just a fiscal issue. This is a moral issue of whether this generation, my generation, and people that are even younger than me but spending a lot of money, high in the hog and leave it to young people to pick up the bill. Without a plan to put our fiscal situation on a better path, the next generations will have lower quality of life than one we've experienced. We can't let that happen. We must take action to correct our course. I urge my colleagues to support the cut, cap, and balance plan. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that time from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. on a motion to proceed to H.R. 2560 be equally divided between the majority leader and the Republican leader.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I rise today in opposition to the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act of 2011. Rather than taking a balanced approach that requires shared sacrifice, House Republicans have passed legislation that would gut essential services for average Americans, asking nothing of the wealthy and the privileged. Such a misguided approach would cost countless American jobs while doing nothing to solve America's long-term deficit challenges. Madam President, in my opinion, this bill, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act, fails to measure up as a serious proposal to address the structural deficit that our nation faces. It is misguided and assumes that our nation will pay no price if we fail to invest in our future. And these are some of the assumptions of this measure. Highways will not buckle, they say. Pipes will not rust. Bridges will not collapse. And there's no need to invest in the next generation of innovators to keep America's competitive advantage. This bill, Mr. President, would gut the very funding we need to revitalize our economy and invest in the future. Cut, Cap, and Balance would render Congress essentially powerless to address revenues, thereby pushing America further down the road to economic inequality by ensuring that the wealthy do not have to share any sacrifice. And whatever might be said about this legislation, to call it balanced is a cruel irony. In fact, all of the sacrifices demanded of the poor and the working families. This measure forces Congress to slash programs that average Americans rely on for education, housing assistance, food safety, safer air control, and clean water. Now, Mr. President, we have an aging population, which means that increasing costs for Social Security and Medicare are a reality that must be dealt with. The baby boomers, for example, are retiring now, which increases the need for Social Security and Medicare. And while those programs are not subject to sequester, how will we meet the higher costs and at the same time bring down overall spending to 18% of gross profit, a level that has not been achieved since the 60s? My colleagues should not kid themselves. Mandating a balanced budget by 2020 while taking revenues off the table will require draconian cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Mr. President, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I take particular note of the impact cut, cap, and balance would have on non-defense discretionary spending. A 10-year freeze on domestic spending that does not adjust for inflation would have a devastating effect and impact on the ability of all non-defense departments and agencies to carry out their missions. My colleagues should know that over 10 years, such a cap would amount to a 33% cut in real dollars. Such a level of cuts would make it impossible for the United States to compete on a global scale. Our infrastructure, our education system, our technology, everything we need to remain a great nation will be drastically underfunded or simply not funded at all. Mr. President, I hope we all understand that we're not talking about nice-to-have things. We are talking about investments that are necessary to maintain the quality of life for the middle class. Education is not optional. Roads and sewers, clean air, and clean water are not optional. Meeting the basic nutritional needs of our poorest children should not be optional. This great nation, Mr. President, was built on such investments made in the best interest of the American people, all the people, Mr. President, not just the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%. Now, I would like to take a brief moment to provide a few specifics about the impact of this act. While it is not possible to predict specific impacts 10 years down the road, it is certainly possible to give examples of what the American people would experience in the near term as a result of this deeply flawed bill. In fiscal year 2012, Head Start funding would decrease by more than $900 million, eliminating comprehensive early childhood services for over 130,000 low-income children and their families, resulting in the termination of 30,000 teachers, teacher assistants, and related staff. The combined cost of mandatory programs such as food stamps, school lunch program, coupled with domestic spending reductions contained in this bill would be a double blow to the nation's most vulnerable populations. With these cuts, there would be 13 million fewer meals served to our seniors who can't afford it. So let me be blunt. If this bill is enacted, children and seniors in this great nation will go hungry in far larger numbers than today. Mr. President, we all recognize that reducing waste, fraud, and abuse are essential components of getting our fiscal house in order. For example, every $1 billion we save is $1 billion we can use to reduce the deficit or better invest in America's future. And yet this bill would reduce funding for the Internal Revenue Service by some $1.8 billion below the President's request for fiscal year 2012, which would cripple its effort to fund fraud and eliminate waste and abuse. The IRS could be forced to furlough between 4,100 and 5,000 employees, and most of them are enforcement agents. Furthermore, a cut to IRS funding would increase the deficit by about $4 billion a year, beginning in 2013. Because, Mr. President, keep in mind that every dollar investment in law enforcement resources brings in $5 in tax revenues. Those are facts established over the years. Finally, Mr. President, I would note that a cap on the federal budget means that we are unable to make smart choices between our future investments. As an example, the Bureau of Prisons inmate population is expected to grow roughly 250,000 federal inmates by 2018, an increase of more than 31,000 prisoners, or 15% over the next 8 years. A growing inmate population coupled with a spending cap for Department of Justice activities will mean further severe cuts to other functions of the Department of Justice. Federal, state, and local public safety efforts would be cut in order to pay the required cost of housing prisoners. Mr. President, yesterday, as we recall, 97 senators voted in favor of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bill. This shows that the Senate is capable of producing and passing fiscally responsible appropriation bills that meets the nation's needs and that are strong in bipartisan support. The real answer to our fiscal crisis has not changed before the debate began. We must cut spending in a responsible fashion. We must reform entitlement programs to make certain that they survive for future generations. And we must reform our tax code to allow for sufficient revenues to meet the needs of an aging population and the challenges of a global economy. Mr. President, cup, cap, and balance, there's none of these things. And so I urge my colleagues respectfully to reject this misguided measure.